Today, you can walk into any grocery store in the world. You can pick up a carton of milk and pour it for your child without a single thought. You trust the label. You trust the seal. You trust the system. But that ordinary safety is an illusion. It is not a natural right. It was bought, and it was paid for in blood. In the late 1800s, the food sitting in the average kitchen was effectively a chemical weapon. There was no FDA. There were no ingredient lists. A company could put absolutely anything into a bottle and sell it to a family. And they did. They whitened bread with crushed bone and plaster. They dyed canned peas green with copper sulfate. They preserved rotting meat with borax. And to keep old, sour milk from smelling bad, they laced it with formaldehyde, the exact same chemical used to embalm corpses. In the worst years in the crowded cities of America, thousands of infants died, poisoned by the milk they were fed. The government knew. The corporations knew. And they did absolutely nothing until one government chemist realized that the only way to prove the food was homicidal was to find 12 healthy young men and feed them the poison himself. If you appreciate these deep dives into the terrifying, forgotten history of the everyday things around us, take a second to subscribe. To understand how bad things were, you have to understand the late 19th century. America was moving from the farm to the city. For the first time in human history, millions of people were eating food that they did not grow, prepared by people they would never meet, hundreds of miles away. And the food industry realized something very quickly. Fresh food spoils. Spoiled food costs money, but chemicals are cheap. If meat started to rot, you didn't throw it away. You scrubbed it with salicylic acid to remove the slime and sold it anyway. If coffee beans were too expensive, you sold bags of roasted sawdust, dirt, and baked horse liver, and called it coffee. If you needed to make cheap candy for children, you dyed it bright red, using lead and arsenic. It was a massive, unregulated chemistry experiment. And the public was the test subject. People were getting sick. Chronic stomach aches, headaches, sudden, unexplained deaths. But because the poisons were hidden, no one could prove it was the food. The meat packers and the dairy conglomerates had immense political power. Whenever someone suggested a law to check the food, lobbyists crushed it. They argued that these chemicals were harmless preservatives. They called the critics hysterical. They needed absolute, undeniable proof that the food supply was toxic. And a man named Harvey Washington Wiley was about to get it for them. But before Wiley could act, the tragedy had to reach a breaking point. And it did, with the most vulnerable victims imaginable. Before refrigeration, bringing milk from the countryside into the city was a race against time. In the summer heat, milk would sour in hours. But the dairy industry found a miraculous solution, a clear, sweet-tasting liquid that could be stirred into a vat of rotting milk. It instantly stripped away the sour smell and made the milk taste fresh again. They called it a preservative. The chemical name was formaldehyde. Formaldehyde is highly toxic. It alters proteins. It hardens tissues. It is literally used by morticians to stop a human body from decaying. And milk companies were pouring it into the bottles they sold to mothers in the slums of New York, Chicago, and Boston. The results were catastrophic. Infants cannot process formaldehyde. Their tiny organs began to fail. During the hot summer months, the infant death rate in the cities climbed to staggering heights. Reformers counted the dead in the thousands. Children who had done nothing more than drink a glass of milk. The scandal broke. Newspapers called it embalmed milk. The public was furious, but the politicians still refused to act. The chemical companies produced their own scientists who stood before Congress and swore that formaldehyde was perfectly safe in small doses. Dr. Harvey Wiley watched this happen. He was the chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture. He knew the chemicals were killing people, but he realized that arguing over test tubes wasn't working. He didn't need a lab rat. He needed humans. In 1902, Wiley secured a $5,000 grant from Congress for a very specific, very dangerous experiment. He put up flyers around the Department of Agriculture looking for volunteers. The requirements were strict. He needed young, perfectly healthy men. They would be given free room and board. They would be fed 3 massive gourmet meals a day, cooked by a master chef. There was just one catch. Half of the men would have their food laced with poison, and they would not be told which half they were in. You might expect that no one would answer a call like that. The opposite happened. Hundreds of men applied. Wiley later joked that his laboratory had become the most highly advertised boarding house in the world. One applicant wrote in to boast that he was afflicted with 7 different diseases, that doctors had told him 15 years earlier he had only months to live, and that his stomach, in his words, could hold anything. 12 men were chosen. They were clerks, scientists, and college students. They had to sign waivers absolving the government of all liability if they died. The press immediately gave them a nickname. They called them the Poison Squad. Wiley converted the basement of the Department of Agriculture into a dining room and a laboratory. It was heavily monitored. The men had to weigh themselves every day. They had to measure their heart rates, check their temperatures, and hand over every ounce of their bodily waste for chemical analysis. They could not eat or drink anything outside of that basement. And then the experiment began. For the first trial, Wiley chose borax, the same chemical used in laundry detergent which meatpackers were scrubbing onto old beef. He started with small doses hidden in the butter and the milk. The men ate. They joked. They felt fine. The food industry celebrated. They thought Wiley was about to prove them right. But then, Wiley increased the dose. He put the borax into gelatin capsules and had the men swallow them with their meals. And the reality of what they were doing began to set in. The men began to change. The healthy, vibrant clerks who had walked into that basement months ago started turning pale. They lost their appetites. They developed severe, crippling stomach pains. Their hair began to thin. They suffered from intense nausea, headaches, and a heavy, sinking exhaustion. Some men became so weak they couldn't get out of bed. There was a sign that hung outside that basement dining room. Wiley had it painted himself. It read, "None but the brave can eat the fare." It was meant as dark humor. It did not stay funny for long. The borax was so foul that the men learned to taste it in the butter and the milk and quietly began avoiding those dishes. So Wiley took the choice away from them. He sealed the borax inside gelatin capsules and stood over the table, watching to make certain every man swallowed his dose. By the summer of 1903, after nearly a year of it, the Borax Squad did something no one expected. They went on strike. In the brutal Washington heat, the men at the borax table simply refused to take any more. Wiley, cornered, agreed to end that trial early. But he did not stop. He moved on to the next chemical: salicylic acid, sodium benzoate, copper sulfate, and finally, formaldehyde. And the further he went down that list, the worse it became. The borax, it turned out, had been the gentle one. When Wiley tested sodium benzoate, the damage was so severe that out of the 12 men, only 3 were able to finish the trial. The other 9 were too sick to continue. For 5 years, from 1902 to 1907, different groups of men cycled through that basement, eating the exact same chemicals that the American public was eating every single day. The press became obsessed with them. Newspapers ran daily updates on their health. A popular song was even written about them. To the public, they were folk heroes. 12 brave young men eating poison for their country. But inside the basement, it was not a song. The men were suffering. They lost massive amounts of weight. They were left, in Wiley's own words, unfit for work of any kind. And the psychological toll of sitting down to a beautiful steak, knowing it was laced with something that was quietly destroying your organs, was immense. But Wiley was meticulous. He documented every headache, every ounce of weight lost, every trace of poison in their blood. He finally had his undeniable proof. The chemicals used by the food industry were not harmless preservatives. They were toxins that built up in the human body, slowly shutting it down. Even with the poison squad suffering plastered across the newspapers, the food lobby fought back. They tried to have Wiley fired. They suppressed his reports. They pressured politicians to keep the laws from changing. But they couldn't stop the momentum. The women of America, the mothers who were buying this food for their children, began to organize. Millions of women petitioned the government, demanding clean food. And then, in 1906, a writer named Upton Sinclair published a novel called The Jungle. It exposed the horrifying, unsanitary conditions of the Chicago meatpacking plants. It described rats, rotting meat, and even human workers falling into the rendering vats and being sold as lard. The public outrage was explosive. The president, Theodore Roosevelt, read the book, read Wiley's Poison Squad reports, and finally forced Congress to act. In 1906, the United States passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. It was the first law of its kind. It required accurate labeling. It banned the use of toxic, poisonous adulterants, and it led directly to the creation of the agency we now know as the FDA. The formaldehyde was pulled from the milk. The copper was pulled from the peas. The infant death rate began to fall. But the victory cost Wiley dearly. The industries he had fought never forgave him. They worked for years to undermine his authority and eventually pushed him out of the very government department he had served. He spent the rest of his life warning that the law he had won was being quietly weakened by the very forces he had exposed. And none of it would have happened without the 12 men who walked into a basement in 1902 and willingly poisoned themselves so that no one else would have to. Today, their names are mostly forgotten. They didn't get medals. They didn't get rich. They simply went back to their lives, carrying the physical scars of the chemicals they had consumed. We live in a world built on their suffering. Every time you look at an ingredient list, every time you trust that the milk in your fridge is just milk, you are relying on a standard that was written in the blood of the poison squad. If you appreciate these deep dives into the darker origins of the world we take for granted, subscribe to the channel. Because the history of your home is far more terrifying than you think. And tell me in the comments, would you have volunteered for the poison squad?